My name is Anna Tamara, and this presentation is entitled Gardens Below the Watchtower, Gardens and Meaning in World War II Japanese American Concentration Camps. This presentation explores the many camp gardens, places of Issei and Nisei agency within landscapes of persecution and trauma. I start this presentation with this beautiful painting of a garden with mountains in the background by artist Kei Uetsuzi because it illustrates the beauty that Nikkei created while under extreme duress and in a politicized environment. These camp gardens evoke complex personal motivations and social interactions spawned by a community in turmoil. This painting is of Merritt Park in Manzanar in 1945. This photograph is by Ansel Adams of Merritt Park, also in 1945. Nikkei transformed the camp landscapes, ameliorating and beautifying them through thousands of landscape and garden projects. Gardens buffered the severity and monotony of the military-issue barracks, barbed wire, and structured layouts of the camps. More importantly, the acts of creating and maintaining ornamental gardens buffered the psychological and physical trauma of the incarceration experience. This image is by Dorothea Lang of Manzanar. First of all, there is a danger in simply showing you a bunch of pictures of pretty gardens that have government-issued barracks buildings in the background. My caution and prelude in this presentation is that I don't want to lull you into a false sense that these were comfortable, livable, and emotionally sustainable places. Most of you are already aware of the circumstances of incarceration and have learned about it from your relatives, books, and this incredible virtual pilgrimage. It's critical that we place our understanding of these gardens within the context of personal and communal trauma, of persecution, fear, anxiety, and the daily experiences of injustice. This photograph by photographer Toyo Miyatake shows boys along the fence line at Manzanar. Words to understand the context of the incarceration include race prejudice, Issei Nisei, yellow journalism, Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066, wartime hysteria, exclusion, Terminal Island, Bainbridge Island, tags, horse stalls, trains, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain, questions 27 and 28, segregation, 442, MIS, gold stars, honor roll, resistance, renunciation, voluntary leave, and so many more. It's only with a deep understanding and feeling that this history that we can really understand the restorative power of gardens in the camps. For to understand healing gardens, one must understand what needs healing. This photograph shows women along a barrack with canna flowers along the garden fronts at Jerome. This presentation also represents a paradigm shift that has occurred over the past 2 to 3 decades in the scholarly work related to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Following the landmark Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and national recognition of this wrongdoing, new areas of research began to emerge. This examination of garden building and gardens in the camps illustrates how scholarship has been able to move past the recognition of a wrongdoing and now explore a wider range of topics related to the incarceration experience. This image shows a man in his flower garden next to his barrack. Many of the images I will show you over the remainder of this presentation offer a glimpse into the camps that contradicts typical descriptions of them as dust-blown, barren, and oppressive places. Few discussions of the incarceration have gone further than describing the camp landscapes as cruel places comprised of tar paper barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers and located in remote and desolate areas. While these descriptions are generally accurate, they do not represent the complexity of the camp landscapes as individual places set within their own geographic context, nor do they portray the human forces which created, maintained, and actively transformed them into semi-livable places. This image shows the front cover of a book called Beauty Behind Barbed Wire. In 1952, Alan Eaton published Beauty Behind Barbed Wire, a book documenting the works of art created by Japanese Americans during their incarceration. Eaton wrote, quote, It would take several volumes to adequately record and describe the gardens of the 10 relocation centers. Quote, today, nearly all of the incarcerated gardeners and their descendants are deceased. Yet, through oral histories, we have records and recordings of the memories of the gardens. This image shows Mr. Kogita and his family standing in front of a Japanese-style garden in Seattle, Washington in the pre-war period. The garden building that occurred in the camps had roots in Japanese culture and pre-World War II professions. In the pre-war period, Issei ranged in experience from hobby gardeners and landscape laborers to formally educated nursery and landscape businessmen. For many Issei, landscape gardening developed out of traditional Japanese landscape aesthetics and a cultural and spiritual affinity with nurturing plant life. For the vast majority of Issei gardeners, like the one shown in this photograph, landscaping was a marketable, acceptable, and profitable profession learned in America. Issei practiced urban landscaping in most metropolitan areas along the West Coast. When Pearl Harbor was bombed and exclusion followed, the mass removal of all West Coast Nikkei resulted in labor shortages in agriculture and urban landscaping businesses. For Issei, with more extensive businesses, the exclusion proved catastrophic both economically and socially. When people received the notices that they must leave their homes and prepare for life at the assembly centers, plants were often transported with them. Even in the assembly centers, people began gardening almost immediately in the small spaces between stalls. For women, and especially mothers, producing vegetables in the victory gardens allowed them to contribute to their family and community welfare. This image shows a woman transporting plants. Transported plants were evidence of an enduring people-plant relationship. On the trains to the more permanent inland camps, many Issei transported bonsai trees, potted plants, and tree saplings to their new homes in the camps. Plants transported from home were companions and keepsakes in the newly developed camp gardens. This is an image of Minidoka under construction. When Nikkei arrived at the camps, the environmental conditions were dire. The clearing of sagebrush, hasty construction of barracks, and large-scale disruption of the fragile soils created swirling masses of dust while the temperatures reached into the hundreds. This image of a boy watering down the dust at Poston illustrates the early conditions in the camps. This image shows a row of barracks at Minidoka. Initially, the living conditions were very oppressive. Accounts of this early period always featured dust, extreme heat, and a lack of sanitary facilities. This image shows mud surrounding the barracks at Minidoka. The early steps of garden building illustrate the need for appropriation and beautification, and the deep-seated human and cultural need to transform the camp from stranger, symbol of betrayal, and prison into a habitable environment. This image shows lawns in front of barracks at Manzanar. The initial acts of amelioration in garden building happened almost immediately. As barracks were completed, the WRA encouraged the planting of lawns to stabilize the windswept soils. At Manzanar, irrigation water was readily available from the upcountry reservoirs. Additionally, land improvements such as gardens, parks, and ball fields improved the WRA's reputation for providing humane living conditions while soothing the conscience of government officials and the concerned public. This image shows one of the first ornamental gardens completed by former Bel Air landscaper William Katsuki at Manzanar. Manzanar was situated in the Owens Valley, which provided an abundance of natural materials and a diversity of rocks, vegetation, which could be transplanted and brought from the hills and mountains and wetlands. These early acts of garden building were the beginnings of a broader movement to enrich the quality of life through improving and beautifying the camp landscapes. Urban Nikkei created more elaborately styled gardens than did rural populations, as urban Nikkei were experienced ornamental gardeners and landscape professionals. Because Manzanar held the largest number of urban landscape professionals, it contained the largest number and most sophisticated ornamental gardens of the 10 camps. This image shows a woman building a rock pond outside of her barrack. The vast majority of ornamental gardens were built by Issei men. While women raised vegetables and tended flower gardens, few were active designers and builders of ornamental gardens. This photo is the sole image of a woman actually constructing an ornamental garden that I found. Her name was Mrs. Arima, and she is building a garden and pond outside her stoop at Jerome Camp in Arkansas. This image shows Mr. Takemura at Manzanar, along with all of his garden furniture that he had constructed. Many of the incarcerees were skilled landscape professionals and hobbyists. Thus, creating gardens in the camp was not only an enjoyable pastime, but also an activity to practice and hone landscape skills and aesthetics. This image shows an Issei man surrounded by his dahlia garden. Issei developed the majority of ornamental gardens since they were the most skilled and knowledgeable about Japanese garden traditions. For the Issei, gardening was one mechanism in which they could feel comforted and empowered. The Issei men were burdened most by exclusion and incarceration, as their traditional familial role as patriarch and financial supporter had been completely undermined. Once in camp, their social power as community leaders was denied as well. The WRA allowed only American-born Japanese the right to hold representative political positions within the camps. For the Issei, particularly those skilled in landscape work, developing Japanese-style gardens was one way in which they could assert control over their situation, improve the conditions for the community, and affirm their Japanese cultural traditions, while also soothing the everyday and long-term stress imposed by the incarceration. This image is of Fujitaro Kubota and 4 women tending a garden at Minidoka. What's important to note is that Nikkei also had a set of cultural values that fostered garden building activities, including cultural abhorrence of idleness, a cultural affinity with nature and aesthetics, and the practice of cooperative action for the betterment of the community. Henry Nishi, one of the garden builders, described it this way: Japanese people don't just sit around because they're in camp. They want to be busy. And so everybody kept busy doing whatever. It was a situation where the Isseis especially, they had to keep busy. Thus, keeping busy was part of a larger Nikkei ethic called gaman, which was a determination to endure and persevere. This image shows a woman tending a vegetable plot at Manzanar. Within the context of incarceration, gardens were truly restorative agents. Gardening fostered a sense of empowerment, a way to ameliorate the camp conditions while contributing to the mental stability and physical well-being of the gardener and the incarcerated community. By inducing harmony with environments of chaos and confusion, incarcerated gardeners cultivated tranquility and summoned a sense of normalcy. Gardening was akin to horticultural therapy, forging people-plant relationships that induced a sense of connectedness to the earth and its seasonal cycles. This image shows girls in a garden next to a stream at Manzanar. The acts of visiting the gardens and parks, seeing them in the distance, or glimpsing them through a window were small measures of comfort. The gardens and parks were oftentimes the only greenery visible from inside the barbed wire fence. Arthur Ogami, who was one of the incarcerated garden builders, reflected on a personal experience while he was incarcerated at Manzanar. He said, "I look out the window and we could see the gardens. That one was between the fire breaks. It just gives you a good feeling. And it also shows that people cared. Even though we were confined, people cared about themselves and about their surroundings." Ogami's memory illustrates that even 60 years later, the camp gardens evoked a sense of serenity. His memory substantiates claims that views of plant life and landscapes promote mental health. This is an illustration by artist Chiro Obata of a garden at Topaz. Gardens were also a form of artistic expression and inspiration, both in garden design and representation of the gardens. They were often the subjects of drawings, paintings, and a location for sculpted plants and rocks. In addition, the effects of gardening were cumulative. Every gardening act was an incremental contribution to the well-being of the individual and the camp community. This image shows high school students in Minidoka hoeing an area in front of a barrack. The psychological impacts of incarceration and the absence of beauty in the camp were addressed through school landscaping projects and victory gardens at Minidoka and other camps. At Amachi, in Colorado, the dust storms were so severe that school children addressed the problem with their teachers. The landscaping project began with the children creating landscape plans and then digging, moving rocks, planting ryegrass, and then maintaining the areas for the duration of their incarceration. These school landscape projects illustrated the necessity of ameliorating the camp landscapes for both children's and adults' physical and mental health. This image, shown at the Manzanar Hospital, is of people relaxing in a garden near the hospital. In 1943 at Manzanar, a large-scale beautification project was approved by the WRA at the Manzanar Hospital. The project was specifically intended to contribute to the comfort of patients and their families and for use by hospital staff. The hospital garden at Manzanar was located in front of the patient's ward, where patients could easily move from their rooms into the garden and then sit in the rocking chairs overlooking the pond. This is a contemporary view of the same bench as it appears today at Manzanar National Historic Site. There were three primary types of ornamental gardens in the camps, and this image shown of Merritt Park illustrates the largest, which were parks and large-style gardens which attracted residents throughout the camp. The second type of gardens were block or community gardens created for individuals of a respective block, and the third type were smaller personal gardens that were individually inspired and reminiscent of front yards. Again, this image of Merritt Park by Ansel Adams illustrates the most famous, largest, most sophisticated landscaped area at Manzanar and in all 10 of the camps. The garden builders were paid by the WRA to maintain the environs at Manzanar. Located on a natural spring-fed area within the camp, it was the first named Rose Park after the rose bushes that were transplanted from Mr. Nisei's rose nursery in the San Fernando Valley. Later, it was renamed Pleasure Park, and then finally Merritt Park after the well-respected WRA director at Manzanar, Ralph Merritt. This image shows Mr. Nisei and the landscape crew who developed Merritt Park. The landscaping crew was allowed to travel in WRA trucks to outlying areas to collect rocks and plants, escorted by armed military guards. Merritt Park contained waterfalls, shown here in this image, rocks and boulders with unique colors, shapes, and textures that were carefully placed throughout the park. An immense boulder in the shape of a turtle was placed at the top of this waterfall. The water cascaded over the back of the turtle, and its head divided the stream into two waterfalls. When completed, shown here, Merritt Park became an innovative fusion of Japanese garden traditions that were produced from local and imported materials and tempered by the conditions of confinement. This image shows a woman with her two daughters at Merritt Park. Merritt Park was a destination point of refuge at Manzanar, eventually becoming the most photographed place within the barbed wire fence. Young Nisei soldiers, groups of inmates, and even WRA staff were photographed on the bridges and in the tea house at Merritt Park. Reflecting on Merritt Park's picturesque qualities, Jean Wakatsky Houston wrote in her memoir, Farewell to Manzanar, quote, "You could face away from the barracks, look past a tiny rapids toward the darkening mountains, and for a while not be a prisoner at all. You could hang suspended in some odd, almost lovely land you could not escape from, yet almost didn't want to leave." Quote. Merritt Park was one of the few places in camp where one could be photographed in a beautiful setting without a backdrop of tar paper barracks. These images show contemporary archaeological crews excavating and working on Merritt Park. About 15 years ago, Manzanar began a public archaeology program. The program has focused on the excavation of the camp gardens. Excavated in 2008, led by park archaeologist Jeff Burton, volunteer activities include restoration and reconstruction. The next garden type was community or block gardens. At Manzanar, an inmate-led movement to improve the quality of life took shape in the development of ornamental gardens adjacent to the mess halls. 3 times a day, residents waited in line under scorching sun to dine in the mess halls, as shown in this image. Nearly half of the Manzanar blocks eventually got a mess hall garden. This image shows 2 men standing at the Block 34 mess hall garden. The mess hall gardens were aesthetically ingenious waiting rooms, providing relief from one of the more monotonous aspects of camp life. The garden waiting rooms provided a culturally attractive setting for admiration, complete with architectural and water features, rocks and grassy mounds for seating, and trees for shade. These gardens were similar in size and location, as the standardized block layout provided limited space between the mess hall and the adjacent barrack. In addition, the majority of the gardens were designed with a hill, stream bed, and pond oriented from the eastern mountains to the western lowlands. In autumn of 1943 at Manzanar, the Manzanar Free Press initiated a Best Garden contest. This garden, called Sanshi En, which means Block 34, won second prize. This is a contemporary view of the Block 34 garden at Manzanar with a hill, watercourse, and pond. Also included were 2 symbols, a kame of tortoise and a tsuru of a crane, are symbolic rocks in the middle of the pond. The third type of gardens are the personal front yards or side yards, shown here as an example at Manzanar. Among the numerous types of gardens were vegetable gardens, raked gravel dry gardens, cactus gardens, showy flower gardens, and ornate rock gardens with stepping stones, fountains, waterfalls, ponds, and structures. Many people had victory gardens, which were another method of food production prevalent in the camps. Initiated by the government, vegetable gardens were nicknamed victory gardens to support self-reliance and to conserve resources on the home front. Inmates took on the victory garden charge for their own reasons. By raising vegetable gardens, including Japanese vegetables, incarcerees were able to modify the government-issued meal plans into a diet richer and fresh and familiar vegetables. For incarcerated farmers, the vegetable gardens were a continuation of their professions, offering fresh, homegrown edibles reminiscent of home. This victory garden image is at Rower in Arkansas. This image is of Mr. Kogita in his rock garden at Minidoka. Nikkei built thousands of individually inspired ornamental, flower, and victory gardens in the small and appropriated spaces adjacent to their residential apartments. Mr. Yasusuke Kogita's garden at Minidoka was recognized as one of the most creative, labor-intensive, and renowned gardens in the incarceration camps. Mr. Kogita's garden is a rare and fabulous example of one Issei's creativity, sophisticated Japanese aesthetics, and hard work matched with an overwhelming pride and love for his garden. He created his garden with the help of his 2 sons. He built a wheelbarrow and would travel to the sage lands behind camp to dislodge and unearth massive basalt boulders and interesting sagebrush. Some of the plants were purchased through the Sears Roebuck catalog, while others had been brought from Seattle on the train. He collected the fish from the canal. His garden was featured in the book Beauty Behind Barbed Wire in 1952. What is truly remarkable about Mr. Kogita's garden is that its legacy continued beyond the incarceration period. When the camps closed in the summer and fall of 1945, Mr. Kogita hired a trucking company to transport all of the boulders and many of the plants back to Seattle. Today, his son Paul retains nearly all of the boulders and rocks in his own garden on Beacon Hill in Seattle. There are stepping stones, a rock stone structure and pond, a waterfall, as well as the large stovepipe rock, which stands in 2 pieces along the sidewalk in front of Paul's house. The Kogita garden survives as a tangible reminder of the Issei garden building legacy. This image shows a yard space at Manzanar. Within the camp limits, every garden was created on appropriated space managed by the WRA. Nikkei claimed and privatized government land, developing an ownership and sense of place through these daily and incremental acts of appropriation. Most often, the gardens were located in close proximity to living quarters for convenience and the need to create a partial refuge. But they also asserted a claim of ownership and the creation of defensible boundaries. This image shows a Joshua tree in a traffic circle at Manzanar. Creating a garden also entailed negotiating with the WRA administration for materials and access to vehicles. The use of trucks to collect garden materials, despite wartime conservation efforts, was a point of contention for the local townspeople adjacent to Manzanar. Securing WRA transportation for collecting landscape materials was a regular activity that tested power boundaries and took advantage of WRA property and government materials to serve the collective interests of incarcerated Japanese Americans. In many cases, inmates disregarded WRA rules, sometimes lied, and pilfered materials from WRA stocks. This image is a contemporary view of that same traffic circle at Manzanar. At Manzanar, garden building and material collection repeatedly tested the WRA's leniency. The best example of this was the three-sack pond at Block 22, one of the mess hall gardens. The Block 22 garden builders at Manzanar used forgery to acquire the necessary amounts of cement for its pond construction. The Manzanar administration's rules that landscape projects were allotted only 3 sacks of cement was repeatedly tested. The creators of Three-Sack Pond successfully erased and forged paperwork, returning 8 times, collecting 3 sacks each time to acquire a total of 24 sacks of cement for their mess hall garden. After it was completed, the Three-Sack Pond won first prize in Manzanar's Most Beautiful Garden Contest, a sign that definitions of beauty embraced a subversive quality. This is a contemporary view of the Three-Sack Pond. The Three-Sack Pond was also a staging ground for the largest riot that occurred within any of the camps during the incarceration period. On December 6, 1942, the Manzanar riots broke out with Block 22 as its organizational center. Throughout the day of December 6, furious mobs of anti-WRA inmates met in Block 22 mess hall to coordinate how they would confront the WRA. More than 2,000 people stormed the Block 22 mess hall and adjacent this garden at 2 different meetings that day. The riots in Manzanar were the deadliest of the incarceration period. 2 people were killed and 10 were injured near the entrance to the camp where soldiers fired into the enraged crowd. This image shows the Three-Sack Pond and the wishing well at Block 22. While the Block 22 garden was distinguished as the most beautiful garden at Manzanar, it displayed the social and political complexities of the incarceration experience. It was highly appreciated, constructed through innovation and defiance, and a center for inmates to voice their angers and transform anger into action. This is a contemporary view of the same location of the wishing well at Block 22, the Three-Sack Pond. This image shows the entrance to Minidoka with the honor roll in the background. While the Block 22 garden at Manzanar was the center of a backlash against the WRA, the entrance garden at Minidoka was intentionally designed to broadcast loyalty and patriotism to the United States. This image shows Nisei looking at the honor roll board at Minidoka. The honor roll listing the names of 1,000 soldiers from Minidoka was situated just inside the only entrance to camp, so that all visitors and inmates alike would see it upon entering the camp. The garden was designed and constructed by Fujitaro Kubota of Seattle. The garden contained mounds, basalt boulders, stepping stones, trees lining its edge, and shrubs and flowers planted throughout. Approximately 1/2 acre in size, the Minidoka entrance garden was strategically located behind the honor roll board at the entrance to the camp. The shapes and configuration of boulders placed on the largest mound resembled an eagle, complementing the eagle atop the honor roll board. The combination of the honor roll and Japanese garden encouraged visitors to stop and visit, admire and remember Nisei fighting for the United States, and then stroll and reflect within the Japanese-style garden. This image shows the 2003 excavation of the Minidoka entrance garden. This image shows the honor roll, which was reconstructed in 2011. Beginning in 1945, the WRA authorized incarcerees to return to the West Coast. The closure of the camps was hectic and disorganized. The camps became eerie ghost towns in a matter of months and weeks. The gardens were abandoned and left to perish, except in rare cases. For those who had lost their homes, the WRA provided temporary housing. And in this case, Mr. Matsuda, an Issei from Manzanar, is tending a garden outside of his mobile home. gardeners still found joy and healing in creating gardens wherever they would grow. This is Mr. Ogami standing in front of a garden at Manzanar. Mr. Ogami was one of the garden creators. By creating an intimacy with the landscape through gardening, inmates could assert measures of power and control over their situation. Through gardening, gardeners benefited from people-plant relations, boosted their self-esteem, and contributed to the physical health and mental stability of their communities. Healing or therapeutic gardens are defined as, quote, providing relief from symptoms, stress reduction, and improvement in an overall sense of well-being, quote. The restorative power of gardens takes on a new meaning when analyzed within the context of the concentration camps. This image shows a contemporary view of stepping stones at Manzanar, at the Manzanar Hospital Garden. This is the last slide. The camp gardens were an antithesis to the incarceration experience in military-ordered setting. They were places of adoration, symbols of strength and capacity, and testaments to a human connection to place forged out of prison-like landscapes. In closing, I'd like to quote Mr. Ogami from an interview I conducted with him in 2002. He states, "I think the gardens expressed that just because we're here, we have to do something to refresh our feelings, to express that there is hope for peace and freedom, and you can go to these gardens and still feel it." Photo credits include the Densho Project, Manzanar National Historic Site, National Archives and Records Administration, National Park Service, Paul and Taka Kogita, and the Toyo Miyatake Studio.